In 1981, a woman is found strangled inside her Texas apartment. On the very first day, detectives question a man with a suspicious injury on his hand. He's connected to the victim, he's tied to a bitter financial dispute, and investigators have reasons to doubt his story, but they can't prove he did it, so he walks free. For 45 years, the case remains unsolved. Then, in 2026, investigators finally find the evidence that can connect the suspect from 1981 to the murder, and what they use to get it is something no one could have predicted.
A 79-year-old man is charged with murdering his wife's best friend in 1981.
An arrest has now been made in the 1981 murder of a Grapevine woman more than 4 decades after she was strangled to death.
On the afternoon of February 13th, 1981, a man let himself into a Grapevine, Texas apartment and found his girlfriend lying on the living room floor. Her name was Beverly Bruneau, and everyone who knew her called her Casey. She was 35 years old, a flight attendant for Braniff Airlines, and just hours earlier she had been alive in that same room while he left for work. He had tried calling her that day and gotten no answer. When he walked through the unlocked front door around 3 in the afternoon, he found her on the floor with an electrical cord wrapped around her neck. And the apartment itself told its own story. Overturned items, a struggle that had clearly moved from one room into another, and bloody smudges near the kitchen sink that looked like they had been left by a hand. Investigators moved fast, because the scene demanded it. Casey had defensive wounds, marks consistent with a woman who had fought back against whoever attacked her. There was no evidence of sexual assault, which pointed toward something more personal than a random crime. The medical examiner placed the time of death in the mid-morning hours, after her boyfriend had left for work and well before he came home to find her. That narrow window mattered immediately, because it meant whoever did this had walked into that apartment during an ordinary weekday, and Casey had let them in, or they already had a way inside. Police preserved everything they could, her clothing, the blood at the scene, the disturbed furniture, but a crime scene, no matter how much evidence it holds, cannot name a killer by itself. So detectives started working outward, into Casey's life, her job, her finances, and the people closest to her, and that search led them almost immediately to her best friend. Her name was Thelma, and she and Casey had a history that went back years before that February afternoon, and together, the two of them had bought a house in Dallas, a financial partnership that had outlasted the friendship's original shape. Even after Thelma married a man named Larry Brown and moved out to start a new life in Grapevine, she stayed legally tied to that Dallas property, and so did Casey. Because Thelma was Casey's closest friend, detectives went straight to her home that same day. But Thelma wasn't there. She was mid-flight, working an international route, unreachable while her best friend's body was examined on the ground. So the man who opened the door instead was her husband, Larry Brown. He was a former Braniff pilot and flight engineer who had recently been laid off, and he also held a stake in a construction company on the side. When detectives sat him down that first day, he wasn't a stranger pulled off a witness list. He was already deeply entangled in Casey's world, through his wife, through the Dallas house, and through the money tied to it. Almost immediately, 2 things about him stood out. The first was his account of his own morning, a version of events that placed him near the damaged Dallas property and then at his construction office. Inside the same general window investigators believed Casey had been killed. The second was smaller, but it caught the eye of at least one investigator in the room, a fresh injury underneath his right thumbnail, the kind of wound where the top layer of skin looks torn away rather than simply cut. Larry said it happened at work. One detective on the case didn't believe that explanation fit the wound at all. It mattered because Casey had fought for her life. She had defensive injuries. Blood that didn't obviously belong to her had been left inside that apartment. And here, on the very first day, sitting across from detectives, was a man connected to the victim through her closest friend, who had a torn, unexplained wound on his hand. But detectives also noticed something else in that first conversation. A hesitation in some of his answers, responses that felt evasive rather than straightforward. And the deeper they dug into the relationship between Casey and the Browns, the more that unease started to make sense, because underneath the friendship between the two women was a financial situation that had been quietly falling apart for months. The Dallas house that Casey and Thelma still jointly owned had become a serious burden. The Browns had already bought their own home in Grapevine, which meant they were carrying two properties at once, and the pressure was pushing them toward the edge. According to investigators, the Browns wanted out. They wanted Casey to sell the house, find a new roommate to take over Thelma's share, or simply release Thelma from the obligation altogether. Casey said no, and kept the arrangement exactly as it was, which meant Thelma, and by extension Larry, stayed financially bound to a house none of them lived in anymore. And there was one more detail buried in that mortgage that investigators would come back to again and again: a credit life insurance policy attached to the loan, one that would help pay off the balance if either woman on the deed happened to die. Then, in November of 1980, just months before Casey was killed, the Dallas house caught fire while she was away working a flight. Firefighters put it out, but that same night, the fire reignited, and this second blaze was later described as suspected arson. What had already been a tense financial standoff between two women and a couple under money pressure now became something else entirely: an insurance claim, with real money on the line and competing interests over how much that money should be. Larry inserted himself directly into that claim. Repair estimates were submitted through the construction company he had a stake in, and according to the arrest affidavit, those numbers came in dramatically higher than what the insurance company's own appraisers believed the damage was worth. Suddenly, the fight wasn't just about a burned house anymore. It was about whether Casey would sign paperwork that inflated the true cost of repairs. Paperwork that, if approved, stood to benefit Larry and Thelma financially. Casey's family later told police she believed signing it would make her complicit in insurance fraud. So she refused. And because her name was still on the deed, her signature was legally required before the claim could move forward. Without it, the money stayed frozen. That refusal set up the final chilling piece of the timeline. On February 10, 1981, just 3 days before Casey was murdered, Larry drove to her Grapevine apartment specifically to get her signature on those insurance papers. According to Casey's mother, the visit turned into a heated argument, frightening enough that afterward Casey said she was scared of him. 3 days later, she was dead. Larry himself later confirmed in a follow-up interview that the purpose of that visit had been exactly what Casey's family described: an attempt to get her signature. And in a detail investigators would flag decades later, once Casey was gone, her signature somehow appeared on that paperwork anyway. Detectives came to allege that Thelma added it herself, without authorization, after her best friend was already dead. By the spring of 1981, detectives had motive, opportunity, a confrontation 3 days before the murder, and a suspicious wound on Larry's hand. What they didn't have was proof. This was 1981. DNA testing, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist yet for casework like this. The best hope detectives had was matching Larry's actual fingerprints to those bloody smudges near the sink, but that required his cooperation. And when detectives brought him in again that May for a follow-up interview, Larry gave them a very different kind of answer. He refused to be fingerprinted. He refused to let them photograph the wound on his thumb. He declined to take a polygraph test. And at a certain point in that interview, he stopped answering questions altogether. Without his prints, without his blood, without his cooperation, the investigation hit a wall it could not climb over. Detectives believed they were looking at the right man. They simply couldn't prove it with the tools available at the time. Larry Brown was never arrested, never charged. Casey Bruneau's murder went cold, not because the evidence disappeared, but because the technology that could use it hadn't been invented yet. For the next 29 years, that evidence sat in storage. Her blood-stained nightgown, the original interview notes, the property records and insurance paperwork that laid out a motive in painstaking detail. Investigators moved on to newer cases. Some retired. Witnesses scattered. The file on Beverly Bruneau's murder became one more folder in a growing stack of unsolved Texas homicides, the kind of case families learned to stop expecting an update on. Then, in December of 2010, someone finally sent that preserved nightgown to a lab at the University of North Texas for DNA testing, technology that hadn't come close to existing when Casey died. The results were extraordinary. Scientists pulled a full male DNA profile from blood on that nightgown, blood that did not belong to Casey. It was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, in hopes of an automatic match. Nothing came back. The system searched and returned nothing, because whoever that blood belonged to had never had their DNA logged into the database before. It wasn't a dead end exactly. It was worse. It was a name-shaped hole. Investigators now had an unknown man's genetic fingerprint tied directly to Casey's murder, and no legal way to test it against the one man they had suspected from the beginning, because Larry Brown had never given police his DNA, and nothing in any national system existed to compare it to. For another 15 years, that profile simply waited. Then, in 2025, a detective in Grapevine went back through the entire case from the very start. Not just the DNA results, but everything. The original 1981 interviews, the property and insurance records, the timeline of that final February 10th confrontation, and the wound underneath a man's thumbnail that nobody had ever been able to explain. Laid out together, decades later, the pattern was almost impossible to ignore. This wasn't a case that needed a new suspect. It needed a way to finally test the one they'd had since day one. By then, Larry Brown was 79 years old, living quietly in Loveland, Colorado, roughly 800 miles from the apartment where Casey died. He had spent 45 years building an entire life beyond the reach of that investigation. In February of 2026, Grapevine Police reached out to the Larimer County Sheriff's Office and asked for help getting something detectives had wanted since 1981, a sample of his DNA. But this time, they weren't going to ask for it. Investigators quietly watched his home, waiting for the one moment Larry Brown would unknowingly hand over exactly what they needed: the trash he set at the curb. Inside that discarded waste, deputies recovered soda bottles and a barbecue sauce bottle. Ordinary items thrown away without a second thought. Those bottles were swabbed and sent to a lab, where scientists developed a DNA profile and placed it directly against the unidentified male blood profile that had sat untouched since 2010. This wasn't a blind database search. This was a direct, targeted comparison between one man's DNA and the blood left on Casey Bruneau's nightgown 45 years earlier. On May 28, 2026, the results came back. Larry Brown could not be excluded as the source of that blood. According to the arrest affidavit, the profile was so specific that the odds of it belonging to someone else, a random unrelated man, were estimated at roughly 1 in 17 billion. The bottle in his trash hadn't introduced a new name into the investigation. It had simply, finally, given detectives the one comparison sample the case had been missing for 45 years. Detectives took the results to prosecutors, and on June 8, 2026, authorities arrested Larry Brown in Colorado on a Texas murder warrant. He was 79 years old. He had been 34 when Casey was killed. A Tarrant County grand jury indicted him on June 29th, alleging he intentionally caused her death, either with his hands or with the electrical cord found around her neck. He was extradited to Texas and held in the Tarrant County Jail. His bond, initially set at $2 million, was later reduced to $100,000. He posted it on July 21st and was released under house arrest, fitted with GPS monitoring as the case moves toward trial. As of now, that case remains pending. The DNA result places Larry Brown at the center of the strongest evidence investigators have ever had, but it still has to be tested in a courtroom in front of a jury more than 4 decades after the crime itself. What changed in 2026 wasn't the name on the suspect list. Detectives had been looking at Larry Brown since the first afternoon of this investigation. What changed was their ability to finally connect him, scientifically, to the blood he left behind. For 45 years, Beverly Casey Bruneau's name has been attached mostly to a case file, a mortgage dispute, and a nightgown kept in an evidence locker. But before any of that, she was a 35-year-old woman who had built a career in the sky and a life entirely her own. She refused to put her name on paperwork she believed was fraudulent, even when it made her a target. That refusal may be exactly what got her killed. And 45 years later, it's also the thread that finally helped bring her justice.